Good morning. This is the Countdown to the Open. I'm Matt Miller in for John Farrow. Moments away from the start of trading, we can see that futures are down on the S&P, NASDAQ, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Trading starts in just 10 seconds time. There you hear the bell, and we're looking, by the way, at Instacart here, an IPO today. We're going to talk a lot about that throughout the day. I know that Ed Ludlow is going to focus on it in Bloomberg Tech. Let's take a look at some of the other price action that we're watching this morning. Euro dollar trading at 106.90 right now. I think the 10-year yield is absolutely fascinating, right around 345, right around the highest level that we've seen since 2007. The same is true for the 2s and the 5s at 5 and 4.5 respectively. NYMEX crude up to $93 a barrel. That is not a Brent quote. Brent is up well over 95. So rising oil prices may be threatening the possibility of a soft landing for the Fed. In terms of stocks to watch at the open, one of them is Starbucks. You can tell I've had a lot of their product. The stock under pressure after TD Cowen downgraded shares to a market perform. The analyst writing, quote, "We see worrisome macro and competitive pressures that we expect to challenge China's same-store sales." Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle has more. Abby?
How can we not start out our day with some Starbucks, Matt? But relative to this call, it's a very interesting one. So the stock is down nearly 2% as we do have TD Cowen cutting shares to an inline, so not a dramatically bearish call. But the reason behind it is China. Now, I do have a source who just recently returned from a trip from China saying that the economy there is much worse than what is being reported on, and that the youth unemployment is much higher than expected. So that would confirm this call, along with various China bears talking about the backdrop there, especially around the property bubble and the credit crisis that seems to be unwinding. However, their business in August was very strong. It was up 48% in China on a year-over-year basis to nearly $1 billion. The company remains committed to opening 9,000 stores there by 2025. So you have this real divergence. It's also interesting that this analyst is making this call right ahead of the quarter ending. If he's an axe, it would suggest that he has channel checks that suggest that the business there has changed so dramatically. On the year, Matt, the stock right now is down close to 5% or so, down last year. If it stays down, and I know that we're only midway through the year, a little bit more than that, it would be the first double drop on an annual basis going all the way back to 2007, 2008.
All right, we'll pay close attention to that. Abigail Doolittle, thanks very much for the update on Starbucks. Let's turn now to the IPO market. Instacart planning to sell shares for $30 or more as it makes its trading debut. Shonali Bassick has more on the story. Shonali, we're starting to get more of these IPOs, but they're like down rounds and worth a lot less than they were during the pandemic.
They sure are. At $9.9 billion, that's where you have Instacart valued into the pricing of its IPO. Remember, they upsized the IPO price here to $30 a share is the high end of the upsized range. So they did raise more money than what was initially expected. Let's put that $9.9 billion into perspective, as you've been saying. It is about a fourth of where it was valued at the pandemic, post-pandemic peak when everyone was ordering online. But for the sake of its early investors, think Tiger Global, Co2, that have not had an exit in a very long time, or a significant one at this scale, if you will. You have Instacart now valued at that $9.9 billion, above that about $8 billion valuation it had in those earlier funding rounds when you saw Tiger and Co2 start to get in. Now, a significant amount of its shares are going to be placed into cornerstone investors' hands. That includes Dan Sundine's D1. It includes a division of Norges Bank. And by suppressing kind of the open demand outside of that, these IPOs have tended to get something of a significant pop, at least in this era, if you will, Matt. But remember, the Instacart IPO is facing a somewhat less buoyant market than what we saw last week for ARM. They did get that IPO pop. Klaviyo prices tonight, trades tomorrow. This is all ahead of that big Fed meeting, so let's see if they get what they want. Volatility is still fairly low, at least lower than what we've seen for the one-year mark at its high.
All right, Shonali, thanks very much. Our Wall Street reporter giving us the latest on that. Let's turn now to media. Disney is developing plans to expand investment in its Disney Parks, Experience, and Products segment to $60 billion in CapEx over the course of a 10-year period. Ed Ludlow has more on the Magic Kingdom. Ed?
Yeah, Matt, that would represent doubling CapEx commitments to theme parks, cruise lines, products, and experiences. It's interesting to see some of the strategy playing out now that Bob Iger Iger is settled back in as the returning CEO. Also, another piece of news breaking this Tuesday morning, ESPN and Disney Entertainment CFO Brian Castellani is leaving the company, the latest executive departure. He is heading on to take a role at Warner in their finance team. 24 hours ago, we reported, according to sources, that Disney's looking at what to do with its India assets, perhaps an outright sale of the Disney Star brand in that region, or a sort of combination piecemeal of some of the streaming rights for sports and Disney Hotstar, the regionalized streaming platform, or indeed a joint venture, as Bloomberg's reported in the past. So this CapEx global doubling to 60 billion is kind of the latest hint of the priorities for Bob Iger, but still lots of questions about some of the other media assets that Disney's been asked about in recent weeks.
I mean, such a fascinating story. We heard from Ken Griffin yesterday, I think on CNBC. He's like, I don't know why we're getting all of this negative press from Florida. And I also was doing the math, Ed. The last time I was at a Disney park, 1986. I was 12.
Well, I've only ever been to the Star Wars experience because, you know, I'm a big fan of lightsabers down in Southern California. But let's go on a little trip and check out
Ed loves lightsabers. Yeah. I got it. All right. Ed, thanks very much for that. Let's turn to airlines. The sector tumbling into a bear market as the price of oil moves higher, obviously putting a lot of pressure on their bottom line. Lures investors away from the U.S. Global Jets ETF. It had hit an all-time low against the S&P. Simone Foxman has more on that story. Simone?
Yeah, Jets ETF hitting an all-time low against the S&P, with the index itself trading near its lowest since May. And Bloomberg Intelligence in a note today saying the negative technical signals could push the correlation between that ETF and the S&P even lower because its July peak failed to close above a January high. But stepping back, let's dive into some of the specifics that we're seeing amongst these airlines. Really, it's clear that the sheen of the summer travel season has worn off. Consumer demand may be flagging in the U.S. specifically, especially for domestic fares. We heard that from Spirit, how it's had to go out and discount a lot of flights. Airlines with international operations have been able to hold up a little bit better, but recently this rise in jet fuel costs has really hit them particularly hard, and that's where we've seen the biggest declines since hitting that peak back in July. Fuel costs cited by Delta, American, Spirit, Alaska, United, among others, reporting changes that could be material to their earnings, and that narrative definitely going to be in focus today as we watch Brent above $95 a barrel. Special mention today, we should also watch shares of United. They're trading slightly higher today, but it's the latest carrier to find bogus parts into aircraft engines. That's the result of some reporting from Bloomberg. Disclosed this news after hours yesterday, but it doesn't seem to be moving distinctly negatively today.
It's slightly terrifying, unless the parts are machined so well that no one can tell, and so they work perfectly, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't seem to be a safety issue, of course, at least not yet, and we haven't heard regulators come out and say that, but it is nonetheless concerning to think that bogus parts might be in your aircraft.
Absolutely. Simone, thanks very much. Simone Foxman covering that story for us. Let's get over to Crossmark's Victoria Fernandez, weighing in on the road ahead, writing, quote, "We continue to see many potential market-moving events in the wings. This is why we've been focused on a pullback in the final quarter of the year." I'm pleased to say Victoria joins us now with more. So you think we're going to see the market drop, what, in terms of the S&P by the end of 2023?
I do think we're going to see it, Matt, and you're right, there's all these elements that we see kind of on the sidelines that we're waiting to see them flow through the economy. So obviously the UAW strike, we're seeing that, and what is that going to do to wages across the board for labor? We've got a potential government shutdown. That can cause some volatility in the markets because it looks like it's going to go to a shutdown. It doesn't look like we're going to get an agreement anytime soon. We've got higher yields. You were talking about that earlier, and I think you're right. It's one of the most key issues that we can be looking at right now, and I think you're going to get rate cuts coming out of the market instead of having them priced into the market, which again is going to support higher yields. There's lots of elements that are going on right now that should cause some volatility in the markets, and we have seen, interestingly enough, Matt, that not just the Fed, but global central banks are all moving towards that higher for longer, that'll be supportive of higher yields too.
And the question that that Farrow and Bramo have been debating on surveillance over the last couple of weeks is, do these higher oil prices signal stronger demand growth from an all's well American consumer, or is it just engineered by, you know, OPEC Plus and a threat really to the soft landing scenario? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really more of a supply issue at this point in time. I think if it was in the beginning of the summer when we first started to hear about some of these cuts, obviously there's more demand at that point in time for travel, but we are getting into the winter months, so you do have some increased demand in regards to heating that people need. So it could be a little bit of a combination, but I think supply is the driving force right now. We have a 95 handle on Brent today. That is going to continue to make that core inflation number sticky, and it leaves the Fed really with no choice but to either hike an additional 25 basis points in November or at least keep the level that they're at for a longer period of time. I think that's going to be the focus tomorrow at the meeting. People are going to be watching that dot at the end of next year. Where does that lie? I think it'll be higher than where it is right now.
Absolutely, that and the SEP. The question is, does the Fed watch credit spreads in the event of a downturn? And I actually have a viewer who writes in, a trader, Anthony Stefano of Cabrera Capital Markets. He wants to know, would a blowout above 800 basis points on the 5-year trigger Powell to think that they broke something? And I think, you know, the follow-on to that is, then will that amount to cuts in 2024? What do you think?
Yes, I definitely think we're going to see cuts in 24, Matt. The question I think most people are grappling with is, when are we going to start to see those cuts and by what magnitude? So I think it's going to be probably around the middle or the second half of next year before they start cutting. The Fed has taken a really long time to get where they are, and they have worked very hard to walk that tightrope to not lead into recession, even though I still think we're going to see a pullback. I don't think they're going to be quick to turn on a dime and say, hey, yeah, let's go ahead and start cutting rates and then add to inflation pressure as demand would continue to go up at that point in time. Credit spreads are important. You've got to watch them. Right now, they're still somewhat stable. The minute we see spreads start to widen out significantly, that's going to be a clue to the Fed that those tightening conditions have worked their way through the economy, and it's time for them to take a step back.
So what do you think of, the Alliance Bernstein call today that the 10-year yield goes to 2.5%. Some people are saying back up the truck at these yields because you're going to see massive capital appreciation. Others, like Greg Peters, who we spoke to earlier, are going to say, regardless of that, this is a great return. What do you think of Treasuries?
Yeah, I think you need to have an allocation in your portfolio right now to treasuries, and we're actually doing it more on a barbell where we're taking that yield on the short end of the curve, taking advantage of that cash flow that you can have in your portfolio, but locking in some of the rates on the longer end of the curve. Look, 434, 435 is a very important technical level, and we keep bumping up against that yield on the 10-year Treasury. If we go above that and close above that, then I think you're looking more at a 450 level. But right now, the market seems to kind of keep that cap right there. If it does, and we get through this meeting and the November Fed meeting, then I think you might see yields start to come back down and you can have that capital appreciation. But either way, I would lock in some rates for cash flow.
Victoria, awesome to catch up with you. Thanks so much for joining us. Victoria Fernandez there from Crossmark. Coming up, GOP tensions looming over a potential government shutdown.
I don't think we should have a shutdown, but I agree with you that I think it is very likely. Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer both believe politically it is in their best interest to have a shutdown.
Inching closer to that as the UN General Assembly gets underway here in Manhattan. Team coverage up next. This is Bloomberg.
I don't think we should have a shutdown, but I agree with you that I think it is very likely. And I think the reason it is likely is I think Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer both believe politically it is in their best interest to have a shutdown, because they believe that in a shutdown that the press will eagerly blame it on Republicans, and I think Biden and Schumer think they get a political benefit from it. And so I think their incentive is to try to force a shutdown.
Well, it's not just what Biden and Schumer think, it's what Kevin McCarthy actually said yesterday, that it would be in the administration's interest to have a shutdown. But Ted Cruz says the president also thinks so. Rising tensions on the Hill as Congress faces that looming deadline at the end of the month. House Speaker McCarthy's latest proposal to avert a shutdown is already facing stiff resistance from ultra-conservative members of his party. Here's what he had to say to reporters.
I've told all of Congress, you're not going to go home. We're going to continue to work through this. I'm not giving up on the American people. I'm trying to convey to my members, if we want to be able to win these objectives, we should show the American public our ideas and be able to pass them. Is it a struggle? Yes.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Kayleigh Lyon. She is in Washington for more. Kayleigh, do Kevin McCarthy and Joe Biden agree on too many things for his base?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Matt, because, of course, should something like we saw in the debt ceiling happen, where Speaker McCarthy actually is able to broker a bipartisan compromise with Democrats, it could actually work against him if he wants to keep the Speaker's gavel. That's when we could potentially see one of these members who have been railing against him actually file a motion to vacate and try to kick him out of the job. This is just one of the reasons why this is a very difficult situation for him to navigate. Him saying that it is a struggle almost is an understatement, because, of course, there's more than a dozen members of his own party who have said they would not vote for the deal that was brokered between members of the House Freedom Caucus and the more moderate Main Street Caucus. That, of course, it would include 8% cuts to domestic agencies in terms of spending, also include many border measures, but a lot of those hardline conservatives would like to see it go further. They want deeper cuts. They also want to defund the federal investigations into former President Trump. They'd like to block spending of previous aid agreed to for Ukraine. All of those things would make it even more dead on arrival in the Democratic-controlled Senate and make it very unlikely that it would ever get a signature from President Joe Biden when it comes across his desk. So it goes to show you that this is not looking like it is bringing us any closer realistically to averting a shutdown. It is a very difficult needle to thread, but time is running out to get this thing sewn up. We're just about 12 days away now from that potential closure, Matt.
So is this dependent, Kayleigh, avoiding a shutdown on a continuing resolution, or is it possible that the House gets all of their legislative work done in that time period?
They just really, realistically, Matt, do not have enough time. The House would need to pass 11 more appropriations bills. They've only done one so far, and there's only, I believe, 7 or so legislative days, at least, on the calendar between now and September 30th when that funding is running out. So a continuing resolution like the one on the table that would temporarily fund the government until October 31st looks like it's realistically the only way to avert a shutdown of the government.
All right, Kayleigh, thanks very much. That's an important look at the domestic issues we face. Let's look at the foreign affairs issues and get Midtown Manhattan congestion report. Global leaders gathering in New York City for the UN General Assembly. President Biden delivering his UN address at the top of the hour, just minutes from now at 10 a.m. Eastern. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horton joins us from the UN Rose Garden with a preview. AMH, what can we expect?
Well, we just got some excerpts from what to expect from the president when he gives this address at the UN. You know, Matt, we should note he's the only leader of one of the permanent 5 countries on the Security Council to actually show up. The likes of Putin, Xi Jinping, Macron, Rishi Sunak, they are not here. What the president is going to really use his address, as Jake Sullivan told reporters last week, is that a really big chunk of his address will be about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the president really has 2 audiences here. One is going to be the international community, the global south, that have been reluctant to really want to isolate Russia and ramp up punishments on Russia. And the other, of course, is going to be the domestic audience. If you look at polls, more voters have this fatigue when it comes to sending money and aid to Ukraine, especially Republican voters. And that is why what Kayleigh was talking about has been so difficult, not just to make sure the government keeps funding, but also potentially getting that Ukraine supplemental aid through Congress. What the president is going to say on Russia, Matt, is this. Russia believes that the world world will grow weary and allow it to brutalize Ukraine without consequence. But I ask you this, if we abandon the core principles of the UN Charter to appease an aggressor, can any member state feel confident that they are protected? If we allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation secure? This is the kind of rhetoric you're going to be hearing from Joe Biden when he touches down here at the UN in just about 20 minutes' time.
All right, Anne-Marie, thanks very much for the update. Look forward to the headlines from the president. Now let's get back to the markets. We are looking for some sector price action this morning. In the 20 minutes we've been open, what have we got so far, Abigail Doolittle?
It's interesting, Matt. So we're looking at a very small decline for the S&P 500 of about 0.2%. But a couple of the heavyweight sectors are on bottom. Consumer discretionary down 1%. We also have tech down 0.4%. So let's see if the decline builds up top, though. Energy, not surprisingly. Let's take a look at what's happened over the last 2 months, because you were talking about the airlines earlier and, of course, autos with the UAW strike. Both of these sectors since July down sharply. Airlines, as you were mentioning earlier, in a bear market. This as fuel costs simply continue to climb.
All right, that's what to watch. Markets have been open for 22 minutes, but about to kick into high gear. Coming up, the events that you need to be watching out for this week. That's next in our trading diary. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg's The Open. I'm Matt Miller in for Jonathan Farrow. Quick look at the markets, unchanged on the small caps, the NASDAQ and the S&P, both down right now. Let's get to today's trading diary, what you need to be watching all week. President Biden, as Anne-Marie just told us, speaking at the UN General Assembly in just about 15 minutes' time. Then tomorrow we get a Fed rate decision, and Chair Powell will give a news conference as well, the dots and the SEP. That's the big deal. Could be a hawkish pause that we're in line for. Then the BOE, the Bank of England, announcing its decision on Thursday. Plus, we'll get U.S. jobless claims and existing home sales. And finally, on Friday, a Bank of Japan rate decision. So a couple of other central banks than the Fed making announcements this week. This was the countdown to the open. I'm Matt Miller in for Jonathan Farrow. Have a great Tuesday. This is Bloomberg.
the financial centers of the world. This is Bloomberg Markets with Alex Steele and Guy Johnson.
It is 30 minutes into the U.S. trading. It is Tuesday, September 19th. Here are the top market stories that we're following for you at this hour. Consumer crunch. Oil inching towards $100. We're going to look at what it means for consumer spending and if high gas prices dent Christmas. And Instacart's instant profit, well, the company debuts on the NASDAQ pricing at $30 a share. We're going to get the latest. And Biden tops the agenda. We are just moments away from the U.S. President Biden's address to the UN at the General Assembly as that kicks off today. We're going to sit down with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. From New York, I'm Alex Steele with my co-host in London, Guy Johnson. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets. Guy, I hate to say it, but the most exciting thing for me today is Canadian inflation.
It's certainly having an impact on the bond market. I'm surprised it's not our question of the day, if I'm being brutally honest, though, because it includes your two favorite things, oil and shopping. That sounds perfect.
It does. Wait, why is Canadian about shopping? I thought it was just about inflation and gas prices.
This isn't about, no, two separate subjects. Our question of the day is about shopping and oil. It basically brings together your two favorite things.
100%.
The Canadian thing I think is interesting because I think it highlights the fact that inflation is going to be sticky and central banks are going to struggle to bring inflation under control without maybe jacking up rates even higher. So that's going to be an interesting question. You've seen the reaction in the bond market, but I still think the story, and this goes to the inflation story out of Canada, is about oil. And it's whether or not oil is ultimately the story that breaks the consumer. The consumer is using buy now, pay later, credit cards, delinquencies are rising, student loans are about to kick back in again. You've got all kinds of factors coming together. Savings rates have really been run down. Now you get higher oil prices. Is that what forces ultimately the U.S. consumer to finally batten down the hatches?
Yep. And is that actually weirdly good news for the Fed? Like oil's helping them to do what maybe the rate hikes haven't yet 100% accomplished.
Absolutely. I'm not sure they're going to see it that way. It depends if it's a growth hit or it's perceived as being inflationary. I think that is the, and I don't think we know the answer to that yet. But we have two perfect people to try and get to the bottom of that. As I say, this is Alex's Christmas present. Maybe come early. Does $100 oil crush Christmas, i.e. crush the consumer? Is that what is going to happen in the last quarter of the year? Joining us now, Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent Mike McKee and Christine Aquino, who leads our Markets Today team. Christine, what do you think? Does oil crush Christmas? Is this finally what forces the consumer to batten down the hatches?
Yeah, Guy, I mean, all the things that you mentioned in terms of what's holding up the consumer right now, it sounds really, really flimsy, doesn't it? And, you know, I think we have seen the resilience of consumers on both sides of the pond in the UK and in the US, but again, it sounds like a lot of it is very much debt-fueled, and oil at $100 just sounds like the sort of wild card that could kind of topple a very delicate house of cards, which is what we're sitting on right now when it comes to consumers.
Mike, what do you think?
I don't know if oil will, but Guy certainly may be depressed about Christmas with his list of things that could go wrong.
He's British. That kind of like happens.
The problem is that list, which you could expand on quite easily, throw in the government shutdown in the U.S. and the UAW strike. The problem is you don't know what that situation is going to be like in December or in November when people are starting their Christmas shopping. And that's part of the problem that the central banks have as well. They don't know what's going to be happening then. $100 oil sounds terrible, and if it pushes us up to maybe $5 a gallon eventually, it will crimp some of what's available to spend, but people tend to spend during the holidays anyway. We have seen spending drop off somewhat, but only basically back to where we were pre-pandemic. So do people cut back even further? That's hard to say at this point.
Guy, Ellen Zentner, Morgan Stanley, had a note out time talking just about this and said it takes about 3 to 8 months after the oil shock to really come through, but it takes 3 months for the oil shock to really hit the inflation numbers, and it really just hits CPI, but that's right around Christmas.
Yeah, and it started in June. You take a look back at the oil chart. We are up 30% since June, maybe July, I can't remember exactly, they both start with a J, but since midsummer basically, we have seen oil prices up by around 30%. So we're already well into this effect, and it is already, as you say, Alex, showing up in the Canadian inflation data, and I think we're going to see it showing up in other numbers as well. The big question, and Mike, I'll get your take on this, the big question is, do central banks look through that, or do they see it as a shock they need to deal with now?
They will look through it, at least as long as they can. The only thing that would get central banks going on something like energy prices is if we started to see inflation expectations become unanchored. And we just saw in the U.S. that in the University of Michigan survey, at least, you guys had Joanne on the other day, talking about how we're at the lowest inflation expectations since 2020. And so at this point, it's not an issue. If they did see inflation expectations start to become unanchored, then what you might see is that last rate increase the Fed's been talking about or put into their dot plot just as sort of a signal. But at this point, I don't think you're going to see anything based on energy.
And we did talk to Joanne Shu about just that and asked about gas prices, and she's like, no one's really worried about it yet, and like they just see it coming back down. So the psychology isn't being embedded in that. However, Christine, I feel like Guy did outline a lot of other stuff, which is the savings rate, which is student loan debt, etc. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. I mean, this is what I'm worried about. It's kind of, everything is fine right now, and I completely agree with Mike and the analysts that we've spoken to. This is not a problem for now necessarily. I think what could turn it into a problem is all the other factors that do lend consumers vulnerable to a sudden shock, right? And this could be particularly it. I mean, in the U.S., you know, I think there's a lot more resilience that we've seen from consumers over a longer period of time. Not the case in the U.K. I mean, they're still grappling with a cost of living crisis over there. There's still an overhang of the energy crisis from last winter. We're heading into winter time again, and you can expect people starting to worry about their energy bills again, even though it's not to the same extent in terms of expensive energy prices as it was last winter.
And the key thing that we're all still watching as well, Christine, is what is happening with the labor markets. And that could turn kind of ho-ho-ho or yo-ho-ho into the Grinch very quickly. Because what we're looking at here is a situation where the labor market could turn very quickly. And companies will be laying off people very fast. As soon as history tells us that when the labor market cracks, it cracks fast. We're already seeing participation rate going up. We're already seeing the consumer needing extra money. Maybe actually as the labor market turns, the consumer really finds itself in deep water.
Absolutely, Guy. I mean, that is really going to be the sticking point. And again, just the vulnerability of UK consumers in particular to just the global energy cross currents, in addition to what they're dealing with at the moment, is precisely why, you know, this is kind of worrying for now. And so, yeah, I'm definitely going to be looking out for what we see from the UK CPI numbers tomorrow. That's going to, of course, like give you a sense of the overall inflation picture in the UK, but again, also in the context of still record wages that we're seeing in the UK. And of course, Bank of England on Thursday, we'll see what the Bank of England team, Governor Andrew Bailey, and the rest of his colleagues think about all of this.
Yo-ho-ho? What is that? Is that like a pirate Christmas, Guy? What are we saying with this?
I'll let you figure that one out. Email in if you want to answer Alex's question.
Wait, is this a thing that I'm missing? Do you guys get this?
Yeah, you got to pay attention.
Yo-ho-ho.
You guys have got to pay attention.
Yo-hos? All right, I'm going to think about it. Really good stuff. Okay, and I guess before last we go, and this is because Mike is going to be sitting in, he's leaving for D.C. in just a couple hours. Does the Fed like oil at 100? In that, like, does it help dent growth? He gave me a weird look. But does it help dent growth a little bit in a way that they maybe didn't? That maybe consumers pare back a little bit, but they don't just, you know, fall out of bed?
Well, in theory, that could be true, but they have no guarantee that it would only have a little bit of an effect. And that's the problem. No, they would say if they had their druthers, oil prices would come back down. But at this point, it's really hard to put a damage figure on it because you don't know how high it's going to go or how long it's going to stay there. That's going to be the real question.
All right, guys, thanks a lot. We really appreciate both of you, Bloomberg's Michael McKee and Christine Aquino, as I literally look up yo-ho-ho and retail. All right, anyway, look at another take here from Lisa Shallett. She joins us from Morgan Stanley. Our question of the day is, does $100 crush Christmas? Hey, Lisa, it's great to get your perspective. Does it?
Well, I think you guys have done a great job talking about the potential headwinds that it could provide for consumers. I think the bigger question that we struggle with as we talk to investors is what is it going to do for company profits? And the issue here is it wouldn't necessarily be a problem if expectations were modest. But expectations, as we know, are quite strong. And so part of our reticence about the market and part of our reticence, as you noted, our economist Ellen Zentner talked about, we're entering the fog of so many unknowns, is that expectations are for corporate profits to essentially V-shape and recover quite strongly starting here in the third quarter, ending with, kind of year-over-year growth into next year of 10, 12%. And that's the problem as far as we're concerned, is not so much that, the consumer may cool, but that expectations are that the consumer is not only going to remain resilient, but potentially reaccelerate their spending, exiting Christmas into the new year.
What does that mean for margins, Lisa? What does that mean for costs?
So, we've long been, of the opinion that analysts always misunderstand the secondary and tertiary margin implications of higher oil prices because they seep into everything in terms of transportation and logistics and supply chain costs. And so, we, as we have been, and perhaps excessively so, conservative and concerned about margin achievability. A lot of analysts seem to be forecasting that margins are going to expand, and that's something that we would question. We think that these headwinds are material.
So, Lisa, does that mean cyclicals are definitely a place not to be?
Well, I want to be careful because I think that there's lots of types of cyclicals, right? Some of us would call energy stocks and energy-related stocks cyclicals, and yet now we believe is a great time to be buying them because those may be some of the beneficiaries of what's going on now. In addition, we know that there are some structural tailwinds for some of the more capital spending infrastructure-related industrials that remain quote-unquote good to buy or good to own here. Where I'm concerned is more of that consumer discretionary cyclical. So some of the retail-oriented names would be the ones where I do think there continues to be some risk.
The market's already started to knock those stocks down pretty hard, Lisa. How much more is there still to come?
I think that there's a lot more because I think it has to do with how are we defining what is consumer discretionary. Once upon a time we defined it, simply as some of the general merchandise and apparel type categories. But what we have to remember is that consumer cyclical exposure is quite large in companies that are very dependent on advertising. And I think we know who some of those suspects are. They're among the Magnificent Seven. It's not entirely clear that providers of mobile devices are not going to be impacted by a challenged consumer. So I will just say that while some folks may like to think that the Magnificent Seven are completely defensive, I think in large part they're consumer discretionary stocks.
I love what you didn't say in that. Lisa, along the same lines, we got Instacart, just to update everyone, it's indicated to open at 39. Remember, it was IPO priced at 30. And that's an interesting company, and I'm not going to talk specifics, but just the idea that they're shifting to ad revenue, which you just pointed out. They're very levered to the consumer. And how closely are you watching the IPOs that come out as an indicator of market health and kind of where the growth is?
Yeah, no, so your question is the right one in my humble opinion, and the issue is more around what is the appetite among investors for IPOs and to what extent are people looking to deploy risk capital into some of these earlier stage names. And I think from that perspective, just generically, the fact that we've been able to launch these deals speaks to liquidity in the market, speaks to decent appetite, and those are good fundamental dynamics for the market. Whether or not, I personally would be jumping into a name like this right here, now up, almost, 30% on my IPO offer, that's not necessarily something I would be facing here this morning.
Lisa, okay, final quick question. If the Fed pauses, do I buy stocks or sell stocks?
So our analysis is that, the pause here is not, the elixir. Quite the opposite, especially if the pause is going to lead to your first cut. Typically, when the Fed begins to cut, the initial months after a Fed cut historically have not been good for markets because you do get into a growth scare. You do get into the questions of, hey, does the Fed know something that I don't know, and might a slowdown actually be more imminent as opposed to some big reacceleration. So our best guess is that we're going to move sideways from here off of a pause, and that right now the upside I think is very limited by both very high expectations, high valuations, and earnings that need to be realized against a backdrop of some growing headwinds.
Lisa, before I let you go, too, I just wanted to get your take on yields, because we've seen the 5-year yield hitting its highest level since 2007, et cetera. Do you like yields right now, and do you buy it for the appreciation, or do you buy it for the yield?
So what I tell people is you're always should be buying fixed income or bonds for fixed income. And right now, that coupon payment looks very juicy and very attractive, not only versus recent history with regard to the asset class, but versus stocks, quite frankly. I do believe that the risk is what we would call asymmetric, meaning I do believe that there's a higher probability that there's downside to yields in the 12 to 18 months ahead of us than further upside to yields. But I'm buying for coupon, and I'm not trying to be cute here, thinking I'm going to make a lot of capital gains in bonds over the next 3 to 6 months.
Hey, Lisa, this was great. We really appreciated you spending time with us. Thank you so much, Lisa Shallot of Morgan Stanley Wealth Management. Looking at the S&P down by about half a percentage point. It is 16 minutes past 10. What time is it? I don't know. It's 16 minutes past 7 on the West Coast. We do want to get to the startup, but I do think that President Biden is starting to speak right now at the United Nations. So let's go there first to the United Nations General Assembly and President Biden.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my fellow leaders, about a week ago, I stood on the other side of the world, in Vietnam, on soil once bloody with war. And I met a small group of veterans, Americans and Vietnamese, who witnessed, and I watched the exchange of personal artifacts from that war, identification cards and a diary. It was deeply moving to see the reaction of the Vietnamese and American soldiers. Culmination of 50 years of hard work on both sides to address the painful legacies of war and to choose to work together toward peace and a better future. Nothing about that journey was inevitable. For decades, it would have been unthinkable for an American president to stand in Hanoi alongside a Vietnamese leader and announce a mutual commitment to the highest level of country's partnership. But it's a powerful reminder that our history need not dictate our future. With the concerted leadership and careful effort, adversaries can become partners. Overwhelming challenges can be resolved, and deep wounds can heal. So let us never forget that. When we choose to stand together and recognize the common hopes that bind all humanity, we hold our hands the power to bend that arc of history. My fellow leaders, we gather once more at an inflection point in world history, with the eyes of the world upon all of you, all of us. As President of the United States, I understand the duty my country has to lead in this critical moment, to work with countries in every region, linking them in common cause, to join together with partners who share a common vision of the future of the world, where our children do not go hungry and everyone has access to quality health care, where workers are empowered and our environment is protected, where entrepreneurs and innovators everywhere can access opportunity everywhere, where conflicts are resolved peacefully and countries can chart their own course. The United States seeks a more secure, more prosperous, more equitable world for all people, because we know our future is bound to yours. Let me repeat that again. We know our future is bound to yours. And no nation can meet the challenges of today alone. The generations that preceded us organized this body, the United Nations, and built international financial institutions and multilateral and regional bodies to help take on the challenges of their time. It isn't always perfect. It wasn't always perfect. But working together, the world made some remarkable and undeniable progress that improved the lives of all people. We avoided the renewal of global conflict while lifting more than 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. We together expanded access to education for millions of children. We saved tens of millions of lives who would have otherwise been lost to preventable and treatable diseases like measles, malaria, tuberculosis. HIV/AIDS infections and deaths plummeted, in no small part because of PEPFAR's work in more than 55 countries, saving more than 25 million lives. It's a profound testament to what we can achieve when we act together, when we take on tough challenges, and an admonition for all of us to urgently accelerate our progress so that no one's left behind, because too many people are being left behind. The institutions we built together at the end of the Second World War are an enduring bedrock of our progress, and the United States is committed to sustaining them. And this year, we're proud to rejoin UNESCO. We also recognize that to meet the new challenges of our decades-old institutions and approaches, they must be updated to keep peace with the world. We have to bring in more leadership and capability that exists everywhere, especially from regions that have not always been fully included. We have to grapple with the challenges that are more connected and more complex. And we have to make sure we're delivering for people everywhere, not just somewhere, everywhere. Simply put, the 21st century results are badly needed. They're needed to move us along. That starts with the United Nations, starts right here in this room. In my address to this body last year, I announced the United States will support expanding the Security Council, increasing the number of permanent and non-permanent members. The United States has undertaken serious consultation with many member states, and will continue to do our part to push more reform efforts forward, look for points of common ground, and make progress in the year ahead. We need to be able to break the gridlock that too often stymies progress and blocks consensus on the Council. We need more voices, more perspectives at the table. The United Nations must continue to preserve peace, prevent conflict, and alleviate human suffering. And we embrace nations stepping up to lead new ways and to seek new breakthroughs on hard issues. For example, on Haiti, the Caribbean community is facilitating the dialogue among Haitian society. I thank President Ruto of Kenya, I thank him for his willingness to serve as the lead nation of a UN-backed security support mission. I call on the Security Council to authorize this mission now The people of Haiti cannot wait much longer. The United States is working across the board to make global institutions more responsive, more effective, and more inclusive. For example, we've taken significant steps to reform and scale up the World Bank, expanding its financing to low and middle-income countries so it can help boost progress toward meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and better address interconnected challenges like climate change and fragility. Under the new president of the World Bank, change is already taking root. Last month, I asked the United States Congress for additional funds to expand World Bank financing by $25 billion. And at the G20, we rallied the major economies of the world to mobilize even more funding. Collectively, we can deliver a transformational boost to World Bank lending. And because the multilateral development banks are among the best tools we have for mobilizing transparent, high-quality investment in developing countries, reforming these institutions can be a game changer. Similarly, we proposed making sure developing countries have a strong voice and representation at the International Monetary Fund. We're going to continue our efforts to reform the World Trade Organization, preserve competition, openness, transparency, and the rule of law, while at the same time equipping it to better tackle modern-day imperatives like driving the clean energy transition, protecting workers, promoting inclusive and sustainable growth. And this month, we strengthened the G20 as a vital forum, welcoming the African Union as a permanent member. By upgrading and strengthening our institutions, that's only half of the picture. We must also forge new partnerships, confront new challenges. Emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence hold both enormous potential and enormous peril. We need to be sure they are used as tools of opportunity, not as weapons of oppression. Together with leaders around the world, the United States is working to strengthen rules and policies so AI technologies are safe before they're released to the public. To make sure we govern this technology, not the other way around, having it govern us. And I'm committed to working through this institution and other international bodies and directly with leaders around the world, including our competitors, to ensure we harness the power of artificial intelligence for good while protecting our citizens from its most profound risk. It's going to take all of us. I've been working on this for a while, as many of you have. It's going to take all of us to get this right. In every region of the world, the United States is mobilizing strong alliances, versatile partnerships, common purpose, collective action to bring new approaches to our shared challenges. Here in the Western Hemisphere, we united 21 nations in support of the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection, launching a region-wide approach to a region-wide challenge to better uphold laws and protect the rights of migrants. In the Indo-Pacific, we've elevated our Quad partnership with India, Japan, and Australia to deliver concrete progress for the people of the region on everything from vaccines to maritime security. Just yesterday, after 2 consultations and diplomacy, the United States brought together dozens of nations across 4 continents to establish a new partnership for Atlantic cooperation so that the coastal Atlantic countries can better cooperate on science, technology, environmental protection, and sustainable economic development. We brought together nearly 100 countries in a global coalition to counter fentanyl and synthetic drugs to reduce the human cost of this affliction, and it is real. And as the nature of the terrorist threats evolve and the geography expands to new places, we're working with our partners to bring capabilities to bear to disrupt plotting, degrade networks, and protect all of our people. Additionally, we convened the Summit for Democracy to strengthen democratic institutions, root out corruption, and reject political violence. And in this moment where democratically elected governments have been toppled in quick succession in West and Central Africa, we're reminded that this work is as urgent and important as ever. We stand with the African Union and ECOWAS and other regional bodies to support constitutional rule. We will not retreat from the values that make us strong. We will defend democracy, our best tool to meet the challenges we face around the world. And we're working to show how democracy can deliver in ways that matter to people's lives. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment addresses the enormous need and opportunity for infrastructure investment in low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Through strategic, targeted public investments, we can unlock enormous amounts of private sector financing. The G7 has pledged to work with parties to collectively mobilize $600 billion in infrastructure financing by 2027. The United States has already mobilized more than $30 billion to date. We're creating a race to the top with projects that have high standards for workers, the environment, and intellectual property while avoiding the trap of unsustainable debt. We're focusing on economic corridors that will maximize the impact of our collective investment and deliver consequential results across multiple countries and multiple sectors. For example, the Libido Corridor will extend across Africa from the western port of Angola to the DRC to Zambia, boosting regional connectivity and strengthening commerce and food security in Africa. Similarly, the groundbreaking effort we announced at the G20 to connect India to Europe through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel will spur opportunities and investment across two continents. This is part of our effort to build a more sustainable, integrated Middle East. It demonstrates how Israel's greater normalization and economic connection with its neighbors is delivering positive and practical impacts, even as we continue to work tirelessly to support a just and lasting peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, 2 states for 2 people. Now, let me be clear. None of these partnerships are about containing any country. They're about a positive vision for our shared future. When it comes to China, I want to be clear and consistent. We seek to responsibly manage the competition between our countries so it does not tip into conflict. I've said we are for de-risking, not decoupling with China. We will push back on aggression and intimidation and defend the rules of the road, from freedom of navigation to overflight to level economic playing field that have helped safeguard security and prosperity for decades. But we also stand ready to work together with China on issues where progress hinges on our common efforts. Nowhere is that more critical than accelerating the climate crisis, than the accelerating climate crisis. We see it everywhere. Record-breaking heat waves in the United States and China, wildfires ravaging North America and Southern Europe, a 5th year of drought in the Horn of Africa, tragic flooding in Libya. My heart goes out to the people of Libya. That's killed thousands of people. Together, these snapshots tell an urgent story of what awaits us if we fail to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels and begin to climate-proof the world. For one day, my administration, the United States, has treated this crisis as an existential threat from the moment we took office, not only for us, but for all of humanity. Last year, I signed into law in the United States the largest investment ever anywhere in the history of the world to combat the climate crisis and help move the global economy toward a clean energy future. We're also working with the Congress to quadruple our climate financing to help developing countries reach their climate goals and adapt to climate impacts. And this year, the world's on track to meet the climate finance pledge that made under the Paris Agreement, $100 billion to raise collectively. But we need more investment from public and private sector alike, especially in places that have contributed so little to global emissions, but face some of the worst effects of climate change, like the Pacific Islands. The United States is working directly with the Pacific Island Forum to help these nations adapt, build resilience to the climate impact, even as we lead the effort to build innovative new partnerships that attack the global challenges from all sides. From the First Movers Coalition, which is mobilizing billions of private sector community and private sector commitments, to creating a market demand for green products in carbon-intense sectors like concrete, shipping, aviation, and trucking, to the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, which is bringing farmers into the climate solution and making our food supply more resilient to climate shocks, and the Global Methane Pledge, now endorsed by more than 150 countries, which expands our focus beyond our carbon emission targets to reduce the potential greenhouse gases in our atmosphere by 30% in this decade. It's all within our capacity. We need to bring the same commitment and urgency and ambition as we work together to meet the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. These goals were adopted at the United Nations in 2015 as a roadmap for improving lives around the world. But the hard truth is, for decades of progress, the world has lost ground these past years in the wake of COVID-19, conflicts, and other crises. The United States is committing to doing its part to get us back on track. All told, in the first 2 years of my administration, the United States has invested more than $100 billion to drive development progress in bolstering food security, expanding access to education worldwide, strengthening healthcare systems, and fighting disease. And we've helped mobilize billions more in the private sector investments. But to accelerate our forward progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, we all have to do more. We need to build new partnerships that change the way we tackle this challenge, to unlock trillions of additional financing for development, drawing on all sources. We need to fill the gaps and address the failures of our existing system exposed by the pandemic. We need to ensure that women and girls benefit fully from our progress. We must also do more to grapple with the debt that holds back so many low and middle-income countries. When nations are forced to service unsustainable debt payments over the needs of their own people, it makes it harder for them to invest in their own futures. And as we work together to recover from global shocks, the United States will also continue to be the largest single country donor of humanitarian assistance at this moment of unparalleled need in the world. Folks, cooperation, partnership, these are the keys to progress on the challenges that affect us all, and the baseline for responsible global leadership. We don't need to agree on everything to keep moving forward on issues like arms control, a cornerstone of international security. After more than 50 years of progress under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Russia is shredding long-standing arms control agreements, including announcing the suspension of the New START and withdrawing from the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. I view it as irresponsible and makes the entire world less safe. The United States is going to continue to pursue good faith efforts to reduce the threat of weapons of mass destruction and lead by example, no matter what else is happening in the world. This year, we safely destroyed at least the last chemical munitions in the U.S. stockpile, fulfilling our commitment toward a world free of chemical weapons. And we condemn the DPRK's continued violation of UN Security Council resolutions, but we are committed to diplomacy that will bring about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We're working with our partners to address Iran's destabilizing activities that threaten regional and global security, and remain steadfast in our commitment that Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. Now, even as we evolve our institutions and drive creative new partnerships, let me be clear. Certain principles of our international system are sacrosanct. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights. These are the core tenets of the UN Charter, the pillars for peaceful relations among nations, without which we cannot achieve any of our goals. That has not changed, and that must not change. Yet, for the second year in a row, this gathering, dedicated to peaceful resolution of conflicts, is darkened by the shadow of war. An illegal war of conquest brought without provocation by Russia against its neighbor Ukraine. Like every nation in the world, the United States wants this war to end. No nation wants this war to end more than Ukraine. And we strongly support Ukraine in its efforts to bring about a diplomatic resolution that delivers just and lasting peace. But Russia alone bears responsibility for this war. Russia alone has the power to end this war immediately. And it's Russia alone that stands in the way of peace, because Russia's price for peace is Ukraine's capitulation, Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine's children. Russia believes that the world will grow weary and allow it to brutalize Ukraine without consequence. But I ask you this: if we abandon the core principles of the United States to appease an aggressor, can any member state in this body feel confident that they are protected? If we allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation secure? I'd respectfully suggest the answer is no. We have to stand up to this naked aggression today and deter other would-be aggressors tomorrow. That's why the United States, together with our allies and partners around the world, will continue to stand with the brave people of Ukraine as they defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity and their freedom. It's not only an investment in Ukraine's future, but in the future of every country that seeks a world governed by basic rules that apply equally to all nations and uphold the rights of every nation, no matter how big or small. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, they are the fixed foundations of this noble body. And universal human rights is this North Star. We cannot sacrifice either. 75 years ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights captured a remarkable act of collective hope. I say that again, collective hope. Drafted by a committee representing different regions, faiths, philosophies, and adopted by the entire General Assembly. The rights contained in the Declaration are elemental and enduring. And while we still struggle to uphold equal and inalienable rights of all, they remain ever steady and ever true. We cannot turn away from abuses, whether in Xinjiang, Tehran, Darfur, or anywhere else. We have to continue working to ensure that women and girls enjoy equal rights and equal participation in their societies. That indigenous groups, racial, ethnic, religious minorities, people with disabilities do not have their potential stifled by systemic discrimination. That the LGBTQI plus people are not prosecuted or targeted with violence because of who they are. These rights are part of our shared humanity. They're absent. When they're absent anywhere, their loss is felt everywhere. They are essential to the advancement of human progress that brings us together. My fellow leaders, let me close with this. At this inflection point in history, we're going to be judged by whether or not we live up to the promises we made to ourselves, to each other, to the most vulnerable, and to all those who will inherit the world we create, because that's what we're doing. Will we find within ourselves the courage to do what must be done, to preserve the planet, to protect human dignity, to provide opportunity for people everywhere, and to defend the tenets of the United Nations. There can only be one answer to that question. We must, and we will. The road ahead is long and difficult, but if we persevere and prevail, if we keep the faith in ourselves and show what's possible, let's do this work together. Let's deliver progress for everyone. Let's bend the arc of history for the good of the world, because it's in our power to do it. Thank you for listening. You're kind.
President Biden addressing the UN General Assembly in New York. Bloomberg's Amory Hordern has been listening to the speech just delivered by the president. She joins us now from the United Nations. Amory, walk us through the message that was delivered by the words said by President Biden.
Well, he started talking about climate, a number of issues in the world that a lot of countries here, alongside Climate Week at the UN General Assembly, can get on board with. He then, of course, moved into China and how the U.S. views China. He reiterated this talking point that you not just hear from U.S. officials, but as well as European officials, about managing competition with China. He says we do not want to decouple, we are de-risking. And then finally, at the end of his speech, he came to Ukraine. And he said that the U.S. will continue to support Ukraine. He called out Russia a number of times. Of course, Vladimir Putin is not attending this UN General Assembly. But when he talked about Ukraine, he really made it more about upholding international sovereignty for each individual country. And this is really the outreach I think the Biden administration wants on the international front. And he talked about upholding rights to every nation, no matter big or small. Sovereignty, territorial integrity is a fixed foundation of this noble body. And I think that's key for him to really want to make sure that they can keep including the global south to see the world the way the Biden administration sees it. And some of these individuals in these countries have been reluctant to really want to put more pressure on Moscow. Of course, while Biden was speaking, we also heard from Speaker McCarthy in Washington, D.C. And the Ukraine aid is a huge part of a debate right now amongst the Republican caucus. And what Speaker McCarthy said is that he wants to make sure that they are tracking and there's oversight on the taxpayer dollars that the U.S. is sending to Ukraine. And he said he's going to have some questions for Zelensky. He's going to be addressing the UN at noon, but then later this week heading down to meet with Biden and then a number of Republican lawmakers.
McCarthy also had some fairly sharp words for China as well. Amory Hordern at the UN, thank you very much indeed. Amory will be back within the next hour. She'll be joining us from the United Nations. She's going to have an interview with Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. Let's switch gears and turn our attention back to the question that is vexing the financial markets right now. What impact is this sharply rising oil price gonna have? And where does it show up the most? Is it in corporate profit or is it with the consumer? So our question of the day, a fairly straightforward one. Does $100 oil, Brent is approaching that, crush Christmas? Does it crush the consumer? Does it crush the consumer right at the end of the year? Is Q4 going to be tough? A new survey out from MasterCard indicating that the consumer will actually look through this, remain resilient as the holidays approach. Joining us now, Michelle Meyer, MasterCard Economics Institute Chief U.S. Economist. Michelle, always great to talk to you. Perfect setup on a day like today. Oil prices are ratcheting higher. The consumer is already under pressure. High gas prices are basically a tax at this point. Is that going to affect Christmas? Is the Grinch coming in the form of $100 oil?
I mean, obviously, we have to keep a very close eye on the trajectory of oil prices and how much consumers are paying at the pump. But when you take a step back and you think about the trend in consumer spending so far, it's been strong. And remember that the holiday season doesn't just start during Christmas, right? It starts well before that. So it's this extended period of consumer spending where consumers are navigating a variety of different factors as they try to do their best to prepare and to spend during this holiday season. And I still think the number one factor that drives consumer spending and will drive this holiday season is the labor market. And there it has been a story of strength with continued job creation, continued turnover of the labor market, and wage growth that's running above normal.
Hey, Michelle, so what are you guys sort of forecasting for the holiday season, and sort of where and what do you expect people to be spending on?
Sure. So, Alex, we're forecasting 3.7% year-over-year growth as measured as retail sales ex autos from November 1st through December 24th. And that shows, as I mentioned, a spending trajectory that is quite solid, and one that is really kind of returning a bit back to a more normalized pace of spend, similar to what we're seeing in the overall economy. Inflation pressures are moderating. We are seeing a lot more choice out there for the consumer, and we think that the consumer is going to have a lot of power as they navigate this holiday season.
So, Michelle, you don't see a recession under the tree this Christmas. That's not what we're all getting.
You're sticking with this theme of the Grinch. And,
he does. He does. You know, he can be pessimistic.
Yeah, no, I think that we're in a good place for the economy. I think that, you know, it's part of this rebalancing in the economy that's been underway as we settle down to something that I think is more sustainable and healthy growth with more tame inflation pressures, even some price reductions for some categories. So when you think about the economy from a nominal perspective, yes, we're shifting gears into something that's more consistent with slower growth, but I think more sustainable growth. And that's important to remember. And I think a lot of people kind of miss that, right? This idea that we have to shift gears, and it's going to be okay when we do it.
Okay, so I'm going to just actually piggyback a little bit on what Guy's saying. So if I look at myself as a barometer for the consumer, this is what I'm doing. I'm only spending on majorly discounted items. I am buying those things that are super on sale and then storing them for Christmas, and I refuse to spend anything that's full price that I don't need. If I'm representative of that, what does that tell me about the economy?
Well, I think that that's going to lead to a lower inflationary environment, which is actually quite desired after what we experienced throughout the last 2 years of very high inflation. And by the way, Alex, I think that what you're describing really does resonate with a lot of people, and I think the retail community is preparing for that. There were a lot of lessons learned from the last holiday season. When we look at our, daily insights of how consumers spent during the last holiday season, it was one of fits and starts. Focused on those moments in time where promotions were most attractive. So last holiday season, to the extent that it's indicative of what's to come, we had a really healthy start around October with a lot of promotions, a weakening in early November, this big burst of activity around Black Friday, softening again, and then a burst at the very end for those that procrastinated in terms of their spending. So that's a consumer that has choice, and it's an economy that's going to see softer inflationary pressure.
What happens in January, Michelle? Student loans are really going to kick in January. We've all spent a lot on credit cards in the run-up to Christmas, it sounds like. How does the beginning of next year look? I'm beginning to hear a lot of people worrying about Q4, going into the beginning of next year as well. What happens after Christmas? Is this the last big Christmas that we're going to see for a while?
Well, look, I mean, we always have to be on alert. As you mentioned, there's a number of speed bumps that we have to be prepared for as we enter the end of the year and into early next year. And I think that we have to focus on what's happening in terms of overall, expansion in the economy, in terms of how companies are investing in labor, how companies are investing in capital, in IP. That's continued throughout the cycle, despite expectations that it wouldn't persist. And then how consumers navigate this holiday season is going to tell us a lot about the state of the economy in January. But I expect us to come out of this with still